The state is the greatest evil of our time. No criminal enterprise in human history, an enterprise of theft, murder, and genocide, has ever been as successful as the state. What other institution can declare its own thefts to actually be taxation made for the benefit of its victims? What other institution can murder its own citizens and call that justice meant to protect them? If you agree with any of this, then you are an anarchist. But anarchism only describes what you're against, not what you're for. So to determine what you are for, you must answer this question. Is money, capitalism, force, or is it consent? If you answer that money is force, then you are an anarcho-communist. So you can call me Ezekiel. This is Anarcho-Communism. Let's jump in! Those in our audience of the right-wing persuasion might be balking at the word communist right now. It makes you imagine gulags, poverty, and worst of all, bad architecture. You wouldn't be totally wrong to make that association either. However, you're making an etymological mistake. When we think of communism, we usually think of statist communism. Stalinism, Leninism, Maoism, all derived from Marxism. We make this association because it was the statist Marxists who beat out their anarchist rivals for dominance of the left. Long before any right-winger ever heard of Marxism or class consciousness, the great enemy of the Marxists were other leftists. In fact, much of Marx's writings were not primarily directed against the capitalist system. He was so convinced that the argument against capitalism was won that communist victory was not just likely, but a proven scientific fact. So in anticipation of that global communist revolution, Marx saw much of his mission as one to make sure that the kind of communism that took over would be statist. This made the anarchists into the main target of Marx's writings. While in the end the anarchists lost this battle, it's not because they were pushovers. Here's Mikhail Bakunin attacking Marx and Engels' vision of a statist communist future. In the people's state of Marx, there will be, we are told, no privileged class at all. All will be equal, not only from the juridical and political point of view, but from the economic point of view. At least that's what is promised, though I doubt very much, considering the manner in which it is being tackled and the course it is desired to follow, whether that promise could ever be kept. There will therefore be no longer any privileged class, but there will be a government, and note this well, an extremely complex government, which will not content itself with governing and administering the masses politically, as all governments do today, but which will also administer them economically, concentrating in its own hands the production and the just division of wealth, the cultivation of land, the establishment and development of factories, the organization and direction of commerce, finally, the application of capital to production by the only banker, the state. All of that will demand an immense knowledge, and many heads overflowing with brains in this government. It will be the reign of scientific intelligence, the most aristocratic, despotic, arrogant, and contemptuous of all regimes. There will be a new class, a new hierarchy of real and pretended scientists and scholars, and the world will be divided into a minority ruling in the name of knowledge and an immense ignorant majority. And then, woe betide the mass of ignorant ones. Such a regime will not fail to arouse very considerable discontent in this mass, and in order to keep it in check, the enlightened and liberating government of Marx will have need of a not less considerable armed force. For the government must be strong, says Engels, to maintain order among these millions of illiterates, whose brutal uprisings will be capable of destroying and overthrowing everything, even a government directed by heads overflowing with brains. If I could describe the goal of anarchism, not just anarcho-communism, but any anarchism, I would say that the ideology's goal is to create a society of consent, one where cooperation is created by free agreement, not force. Since communists see money and markets as force, anarcho-communists would see cooperation between people brought about by mutual agreement. If, for example, a dam needs to be constructed, the consent of everyone involved in the project will be required. Perhaps getting the cooperation of thousands of people, workers, architects, stewards of the land, suppliers of the goods and raw materials, seems implausible, but there's already historical precedent for much larger projects being created by contractual consent. As Peter Kropotkin described it, we know that Europe has a system of railways 175,000 miles long, and that on this network you can nowadays travel from north to south, from east to west, from Madrid to Petersburg, and from Calais to Constantinople without stoppages, without even changing carriages. This result might have been obtained in two ways. A Napoleon, a Bismarck, or some other potentate having conquered Europe would from Paris, Berlin, or Rome draw a railway map and regulate the hours of the trains. The Russian Tsar Nicholas I dreamt of taking such action. When he was shown a rough draft of railways between Moscow and Petersburg, he seized a ruler and drew on the map of Russia a straight line between the two capitals, saying, "Here is the plan." And the railroad was built in a straight line, filling in deep ravines, building bridges of a giddy height, which had to be abandoned a few years later at the cost of about £120,000 to £150,000 per English mile. This is one way, but happily, things were managed differently. The railways were constructed piece by piece, the pieces were joined together, and the hundreds of diverse companies to whom the pieces belonged came to an understanding concerning the arrival and departure of their trains and the running of carriages on their rails from all countries without unloading merchandise as it passes from one network to another. All this was done by free agreement, by exchange of letters and proposals, by congresses in which delegates met to discuss certain special subjects, but not to make laws. After the Congress, the delegates returned to their companies not with law, but with the draft of a contract to be accepted or rejected. There were certainly obstinate men who would not be convinced, but a common interest compelled them to agree without invoking the help of armies against the refractory members. This immense network of railways connected together, and the enormous traffic it has given rise to, no doubt constitutes the most striking trait of our century, and it is the result of free agreement. If a man had foreseen or predicted it 50 years ago, our grandfathers would have thought him idiotic or mad. They would have said, "Never will you be able to make the shareholders of 100 companies listen to reason. It is utopia, a fairy tale. A central government with an iron director can alone enforce it." And the most interesting thing about this organization is that there is no European central government of railways. Nothing. No minister of railways. No dictator. Not even a continental parliament. Not even a directing committee. Everything is done by contract. So we ask the believers in the state, who pretend that we can never do without a central government, were it only for regulating the traffic, we ask them, but how do European railways manage without them? How do they continue to convey millions of travelers and mountains of luggage across a continent? If companies owning railways have been able to agree, why should railway workers, who would take possession of railways, not agree likewise? And if Petersburg-Warsaw Company and that of Paris-Belfort can act in harmony, without giving themselves the luxury of a common commander, why, in the midst of our societies, constituting of groups of free workers, should we need a government? You know, until the end, that sounded downright ANCAP. So keeping up with the theme of anarcho-communists sometimes sounding like free marketeers, here's a quote that libertarians of all persuasions will agree with. In the United States, in the democracy that authoritarians hold up to us as an ideal, the most scandalous fraudulency has crept into everything that concerns railroads. Thus, if a company ruins its competitors by cheap fares, it is often enabled to do so because it is reimbursed by land given to it by the state for a gratuity. Here too, the power of accumulated capital has grown tenfold and 100-fold by state help. Let's not get too carried away by early inklings of right libertarian ideas in Kropotkin's work, though. He was still a communist through and through. The type of society Kropotkin advocated for would have no private property, only personal property. The distinction being that your clothes are your own personal property, but the house you live in, the factory or field you work in, and the road you walk on will all be publicly owned. In his own words, Kropotkin says that an anarcho-communist society should look like this. Imagine a society, comprising a few million inhabitants, engaged in agriculture and a great variety of industries. Suppose that in this society, all children learn to work with their hands as well as their brains. Admit that all adults, save women who are engaged in raising their children, bind themselves to work for 5 hours a day from the age of 20 or 22 to 45 or 50, and that they follow occupations they have chosen in any one branch of human work considered necessary. Such a society could in return guarantee well-being to all its members. That is to say, a more substantial well-being than that enjoyed today by the middle classes. And, moreover, each worker belonging to this society would have at his disposal at least 5 hours a day which he could devote to science, art, and individual needs which do not come under the category of necessities, but will probably do so later on, when man's productivity will have augmented, and those objects will no longer appear luxurious or inaccessible. Now, there's a lot more to left anarchism than what I've shown you, so if you'd like to know more, I'd recommend The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. And while you're picking up books by Kropotkin, I'd also highly recommend Memoirs of a Revolutionist. While political philosophy of course comes up, this memoir is so much more than that. It's about growing up as a prince in Tsarist Russia, the lives of serfs and their masters, of Kropotkin's scientific work, of a nearly deadly mission to China, and of course, about life as a revolutionist and his battle against the state. And finally, if you'd like to see Kropotkin flex his scientific muscle, be sure to pick up Mutual Aid, in which Kropotkin, quite brilliantly in my opinion, identifies that competition is not the only factor in deciding the course of evolution, and that cooperation between animals of the same and even different species is just as important. And that's Anarcho-Communism. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. And if you'd like to help us make more videos like this one, support us through Patreon, Subscribestar, becoming a channel member, and PayPal, links to all of which can be found below. Up next, we're gonna keep talking about anarchism. So ladies and gentlemen, rev up your helicopters.
Анархия, мама, сынов своих любит. Анархия, мама, не продаст. Свинцовым огнем врага приголубит. Анархия, мама, за нас. Анархия, мама, сынов своих любит. Анархия.